When we open up a digital map to explore a distant city or look at our own neighborhood, we trust the technology implicitly. We see the seamless panoramic views, the passing cars, and the random pedestrians walking along the sidewalks, all captured by automated camera cars cruising down the street. To comply with privacy laws, the mapping software uses an automated algorithm designed to do two things: blur out vehicle license plates and distort human faces. We never give those pixelated smudges a second thought, assuming they are just ordinary citizens who happen to be outside at that exact fraction of a second. But for a 28-year-old digital archivist named Clara, one of those digital artifacts was not an error in the system. It was the first clue in a terrifying puzzle spanning over a decade. She was about to learn that some blurring is not meant to protect a stranger's identity, but to hide a relentless, real-world predator who had figured out how to use the internet's most popular mapping tool to document an obsession. I am always fascinated by how far these strange rabbit holes travel through the internet. So while you are getting comfortable for this journey, take a quick second to tell me in the comments the exact town or city where you are pulling up this video today. In the early spring of 2024, Clara was spending a rainy Sunday evening inside her third-floor high-rise apartment in downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Clara possessed an incredible eye for detail, a skill she developed through her professional career restoring and cataloging historical photographs for local museums. She spent her days looking for tiny anomalies and old film negatives, so she was highly trained to see things other people would naturally skip over. That night, feeling a little wave of nostalgia, she decided to pull up a popular online mapping program to take a virtual walk down the street where she grew up. She typed in the address of her childhood home, a modest split-level house located in a quiet, isolated rural town called Pinecrest, Pennsylvania. The screen refreshed to show a bright, sunlit afternoon. The map data for that specific rural block was older, carrying a timestamp from the summer of 2012, the exact year Clara had packed her bags after high school graduation to move away for college. Clicking her mouse to navigate down the virtual asphalt, she felt a warm sense of familiarity. She saw her mother's old blue station wagon sitting in the driveway, and she could see the massive oak tree where she used to sit and read. But as she clicked the arrow to move closer to the front gate, her hand froze on the mouse. Standing right at the edge of her family's property line, half hidden behind a cluster of overgrown juniper bushes, was a man. He was tall, remarkably thin, and dressed in a heavy, dark gray trench coat that looked completely out of place for a warm summer afternoon. Because of the website's automated privacy feature, his face was entirely obscured by a heavy, square, pixelated blur. Clara leaned in closer to her monitor, frowning. Pinecrest was the kind of tight-knit community where everyone recognized their neighbors, but this man's frame and heavy clothing did not ring any bells. She tried clicking to a different angle down the street to see if the camera car had caught a clearer profile, but from every single perspective captured on that day in 2012, the figure remained perfectly stationary. His obscured, blurred face was aimed directly at the front door of her house. It gave her a brief, uncomfortable chill, but she ultimately shook it off. She figured it was just a strange utility worker or a contractor waiting for a client. She closed the browser tab, made a cup of tea, and went to bed. The weird image would have remained a forgotten memory if Clara had not gone to visit her mother the following weekend. While they were finishing dinner, her mother mentioned she had been sorting through old boxes in the attic and uncovered some family photo albums. Later that evening, they sat together on the living room sofa, turning the sticky adhesive pages and laughing at old memories. Eventually, they reached a cluster of snapshots taken during a family backyard barbecue in the summer of 2016, 4 years after Clara had left for college. Clara smiled at a photo of her mother standing by the patio grill, but as her eyes drifted to the background of the shot, her smile vanished. Just beyond the wooden privacy fence at the far edge of the lawn, standing out on the public sidewalk, was a person. Clara felt a sudden drop in her stomach. It was a tall, exceptionally thin man wearing a heavy, dark gray trench coat. Because the camera lens had focused sharply on her mother in the foreground, the figure in the distance was naturally blurry, his features smeared into an indistinct shape. But the rigid, upright posture was identical to the man on the digital map. Clara asked her mother if she remembered anyone lingering near the back fence during that barbecue. Her mother looked closely at the print, squinted, and shook her head, stating she had never noticed him before, and assuming it was just a local resident out for a walk. Clara's analytical training, however, refused to let the detail go. The matching outfit and the stiff stance felt far too deliberate to be a mere coincidence. The moment she returned to her Pittsburgh apartment, she opened her laptop and brought up the mapping software again. This time, she looked for a specific archive tool that allowed users to view historical street-level imagery captured by the camera cars during previous sweeps. She selected the data block from 2016 and navigated back to the Pinecrest address. When the image loaded, her fingers began to tremble against her desk. The man was still there. In the 2016 update, her mother's blue station wagon was gone, but the man in the dark gray trench coat remained on the property. Only he was no longer hiding behind the juniper bushes at the street. He had moved significantly closer. He was now standing halfway up her mother's concrete driveway, his pixelated, blurred face turned directly toward the front living room window. Clara sat perfectly still in her office chair, the glowing blue light of her dual monitors illuminating the cold sweat forming on her forehead. The realization settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. This was not a random sequence of events, and it was not a system glitch. The automated camera cars that mapped the state of Pennsylvania were accidentally logging a chronological timeline of a stalking campaign. Because the man always positioned himself on public sidewalks or roadsides, and because the internet company's automated algorithm systematically blurred his face to protect public privacy, he had managed to remain entirely invisible to her family in the real world. He was using the internet's most popular mapping tool as a personal trophy room to document his progress. Driven by a sudden, frantic burst of panic, Clara began to type different addresses into the search bar. She needed to know how deep this obsession went. She inputted the address of her freshman college dorm building in State College, Pennsylvania, accessing the archived map data from the autumn of 2018. She began clicking through the panoramic views of the campus, her eyes scanning every sidewalk, brick wall, and lamppost. It took her nearly half an hour of meticulous searching, but she found him. He was standing directly across the street from her dorm's main entryway, leaning against a concrete bike rack, wearing the exact same heavy gray trench coat, his face perfectly pixelated by the software. Her breath caught in her throat. She immediately changed the search entry to the address of a small studio apartment she had rented in Philadelphia after landing her first museum internship in 2021. She brought up the corresponding 2021 map update for that narrow city block. He was there too. In that specific panoramic frame, he was sitting on a concrete retaining wall right outside her building's laundry drop-off, his stiff, upright torso angled toward her second-story balcony. Clara stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and slammed into her bedroom door. Her heart was hammering against her ribs with such violence that it made her ears ring. She walked to her living room window, pulling back the heavy curtains to peer down at the bustling Pittsburgh street below. The city was dark, rain-slicked, and filled with the generic movement of headlights and umbrellas. She looked at the pedestrians, wondering if one of those distant shapes was him, watching her from a dark alley or a bus stop. She realized with absolute horror that she had likely crossed paths with this person hundreds of times without ever realizing it, all because he knew exactly how to blend into the background of her life. She forced herself to return to her desk, her mind spinning with a terrifying logistical equation. The Mapping Corporation typically updated its street-level panoramic data for major metropolitan areas like downtown Pittsburgh once every 2 years. The last available public data for her current neighborhood had been recorded in the late autumn of 2022. That meant a brand new digital update was due to launch any day now. With shaking fingers, Clara pulled up her current high-rise apartment address on the map interface. She loaded the interactive street view, looking at the familiar brick facade of her building, the coffee shop on the corner, and the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The interface was still displaying the old 2022 data. She moved her mouse to the upper left corner of the screen and clicked the refresh button, hoping that the system would remain static. The browser window flickered, the loading circle spinning for 3 agonizing seconds before the screen snapped back into sharp focus. A tiny, glowing notification banner appeared in the bottom right corner of the map window. The text read, "Street imagery updated May 2026. Clara's muscles went completely rigid, her fingers locking around the edges of her keyboard. The system had just pushed the new update live. The mapping vehicles had driven through her exact coordinates within the last few weeks, capturing a brand new set of panoramic frames of her immediate surroundings. She began navigating the digital camera view in a slow, clockwise circle, checking the crowded sidewalks outside her main lobby entrance. She scanned the crosswalk, the mailboxes, and the parking garage entry across the street. He was not there. The relief was almost physical, causing her shoulders to drop as she let out a long, shaky breath. But then, she remembered a tech article she had read at work a few months prior. The mapping company had recently deployed a new fleet of specialized pedestrian surveyors who wore high-tech backpacks equipped with smaller panoramic camera spheres. These workers were tasked with mapping out narrow historical alleys, courtyard walkways, and private residential pathways where standard camera vehicles could not legally or physically drive. Clara's apartment building was shaped like a horseshoe, wrapped around a narrow, brick-paved service alleyway that was restricted to utility trucks. Her third-floor unit had a small, private iron balcony that extended directly over that dark, secluded brick alley. Clara moved her digital cursor away from the main street, dragging the little yellow avatar icon into the narrow gap of the service alley behind her building. The screen loaded a new set of panoramic frames, the perspective significantly lower and closer to the ground than the vehicular shots. She clicked her mouse forward, moving the camera view deep into the brick corridor until she was positioned directly beneath her own unit. She tilted the digital camera angle sharply upward, directing the lens toward the third story of the building, toward the reflection of her own glass balcony doors. On the monitor, standing directly on her private, enclosed third-floor balcony, was a tall, exceptionally thin man wearing a heavy, dark gray trench coat. He was leaning over the iron railing, his long hands gripping the metal bars, and his face was a massive, pixelated square of digital blur. He was pressed flat against the glass pane, his obscured head turned directly toward the interior of her dark bedroom. Clara dropped her mouse, the plastic clattering against the hardwood floor as a wave of cold, primal terror paralyzed her limbs. The panoramic backpack had captured that image weeks ago. The man had already breached her perimeter. He was already up there. Before she could even reach for her purse to search for her phone, the profound silence of her apartment was shattered by a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the dark bedroom behind her desk. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a long fingernail scratching slowly against the glass of her balcony door. The slow, methodical scratching against the glass pane continued, a tiny, sharp sound that felt like it was cutting directly into Clara's brain, every muscle in her body locked up, a primal instinct telling her that if she made even the slightest movement, the glass would shatter. The glowing monitors in front of her seemed to mock her, still displaying that low-angle digital image of the tall, thin figure standing on her balcony weeks ago. She realized with absolute clarity that he had not just arrived tonight. He had been coming back to that balcony night after night, standing just inches from her bed while she slept, completely undetected in the shadows of the city. Clara forced her breathing to remain shallow, her eyes fixed forward on the wall in front of her desk. She did not turn her head toward the bedroom. She knew that looking would mean acknowledging his presence, breaking the fragile barrier that had kept him at bay for 14 years. Slowly, using only her fingertips, she slid her hand down into the pocket of her cardigan where her phone was resting. Her thumbs moved by memory alone, unlocking the screen and inputting the emergency sequence for 911. She did not lift the phone to her ear. Instead, she pressed the call button and left the device flat inside her pocket, hoping the emergency dispatcher would hear the background audio and trace her coordinates through the high-rise cellular tower. The scratching on the glass suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, filled only with the distant, muffled hum of the city traffic down below. For a single fleeting second, Clara thought that perhaps the sirens would arrive in time. Then she heard the heavy, metallic click of the balcony door handle turning. She had locked the door before sitting down to work, but as the old lock mechanism groaned, she remembered a minor detail she had ignored for weeks. The sliding track had a loose alignment screw, a tiny structural flaw she had promised herself she would fix after the weekend. The glass door slid open with a smooth, silent friction, and the damp, rainy night air of the alley rushed into her warm apartment, carrying the faint, cloying scent of wet brick and old wool. A slow, heavy footstep pressed against the hardwood floor of her bedroom. The fabric of a long, heavy trench coat rustled softly against the doorframe. Clara kept her back turned, her eyes wide and unblinking as tears of pure terror ran down her cheeks. She could hear him moving closer, his steps deliberate and rhythmic, until the cold draft of the rainy night air was replaced by a localized, freezing pressure right behind her shoulders. A hand, ending in long, uncharacteristically thin fingers, reached out into the periphery of her vision. The skin was pale, waxy, and completely devoid of any defining lines or textures. It hovered just inches from her left cheek, motionless, waiting for her to turn her head. Clara kept her gaze locked onto the computer screen, refusing to look at the entity, even as she felt a cold, shallow breath pass against the hairs on the back of her neck. The voice that followed did not sound like a human throat. It was a flat, synthesized whisper, a sound that carried the distinct, hollow static of a digital audio file being played through a broken speaker. It said, "I have been waiting for the map to catch up to us." The hand slowly withdrew from her peripheral vision, and the heavy footsteps began to move away, traveling back through the bedroom toward the open balcony. Clara sat frozen at her desk for 3 full hours, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of her keyboard, until the first gray light of a damp Pittsburgh dawn began to illuminate the room and the arrival of the police officers finally broke her paralysis. The subsequent investigation into the high-rise building yielded absolutely zero physical clues. The lock on the balcony door showed no signs of forced entry, there were no latent fingerprints on the glass, and the surveillance cameras in the lobby did not capture anyone entering or leaving the premises in a gray trench coat that night. When detectives contacted the Mapping Corporation to subpoena the unblurred source files of the panoramic imagery, the company responded with a formal legal letter stating that the entire May 20 biography block for downtown Pittsburgh had been permanently deleted from their servers due to an unexpected, catastrophic data corruption error. Clara packed her belongings and left the state of Pennsylvania the very next afternoon. She did not leave a forwarding address. She deleted all of her social media accounts, and she took a job at a small library in a landlocked, rural town in New Mexico where the roads are still unmapped by digital vehicles. She lives in a windowless basement apartment now, surrounding herself with analog books and oil lamps, completely disconnected from the digital world. But her caution changes nothing. Clara knows that the world has already been mapped, and her location is no longer a secret. Now, whenever she uses her phone to look up a simple direction or checks the weather in a neighboring town, she feels a cold spike of anxiety in her chest. She knows that somewhere out there, a digital camera is capturing a fresh batch of pixels, and if she clicks through the images closely enough, she will eventually find a tall, thin shape standing just outside the frame, waiting for the system to refresh. We spend so much of our modern lives trying to archive our experiences, building a digital footprint that we believe makes us permanent and connected to the world around us. We trust the algorithms and the corporate firewalls to keep our identities safe, forgetting that every piece of data we leave behind is a trail that can be followed by the things that belong in the dark. True safety is not found in the convenience of being connected, but in remembering that the things we choose to look at through a screen are often capable of looking back. The local mapping trucks have been driving through my neighborhood quite a bit this week, updating the residential side streets for the summer rush. I think I am going to keep my window shades pulled down until the autumn leaves start to fall.
Chicago is a city of 1,000 secrets, but for Elias Thorne, it was just a grid of expensive coffee shops and overcrowded trains that never seemed to arrive on time. At 28 years old, Elias was a freelance graphic designer who lived his life by the flicker of a dual-monitor setup, navigating the exhausting hustle of the Midwest urban landscape. Like anyone else trying to make a name for themselves in a town that thrives on ambition, he spent a significant portion of his day scrolling through rental listings, hunting for a miracle that would take him out of his cramped, shared living space and into something he could finally call his own. In the spring of 2024, that miracle appeared on his screen in the form of a studio apartment on the West Side. It was located in a converted industrial building, the kind of place that usually costs a fortune due to its high ceilings and exposed brick aesthetic. However, the price listed was nearly $400 cheaper than anything else in the entire neighborhood. To Elias, it looked like the break he had been waiting for. It was the kind of deal that felt like a reward for all those late nights and skipped meals. Before we dive into the strange reality Elias was about to walk into, I would love to know what part of the world you are currently tuning in from today. Just drop a comment below and let me know your location. When Elias arrived to sign the lease on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was met by the property manager, a man in his late 60s named Arthur. Arthur was dressed in a worn cardigan and moved with a strange, nervous energy. He seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys, barely glancing at the paperwork as Elias signed his name. He did not mention any dark histories, nor did he warn Elias about noisy neighbors or leaky faucets. Instead, he gave one specific and somewhat odd instruction. He told Elias that if he ever heard a humming sound coming from the utility closet near the kitchen, he should not investigate it. He told him to simply turn up his television and ignore it until the sound stopped. Elias laughed it off, assuming it was just a quirk of an old building with temperamental pipes. Elias moved in on a Friday at exactly 2:30 p.m. As he hauled the last of his boxes into the space, he could not help but feel a sense of triumph. The apartment was beautiful. The natural light poured in through the large windows, hitting the brickwork in a way that made the whole place feel warm and grounded. But as he began to unpack, he noticed a small architectural quirk that he had missed during his initial walkthrough. Situated between his bathroom and his bedroom was a narrow wooden door. It had no handle, only a simple deadbolt. It was not labeled on any map, and it certainly had not appeared on the floor plan he had seen online. It looked like an afterthought, a piece of the building that had been walled off or forgotten. He tried to turn the deadbolt once, but it felt stuck, and he quickly lost interest. He figured it was just an old access panel for the plumbing, a remnant of the building's industrial past that no longer served a purpose. For the first 3 weeks, life in the new studio was perfect. Elias was productive, his clients were happy, and he finally felt like he was gaining some momentum. But everything changed on the night of June 14th. At precisely 3:12 a.m., Elias was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that did not belong in his bedroom. It was not a loud sound, but it was persistent. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his bed frame. He looked over at the glass of water on his nightstand and saw tiny, perfect ripples forming on the surface of the liquid. The sound was coming from that small, handleless door. Elias got out of bed, his bare feet feeling the bite of the cold hardwood floor. He felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck as he approached the door. He leaned in and pressed his ear against the wood, expecting to hear the metallic clanking of pipes or the whirring of an old air conditioning unit. But the sound was organic. It sounded like 1,000 people whispering at the exact same pitch, their voices layered over one another in a dense, suffocating blanket of sound. They were all saying the same word over and over again, though the muffled wood made it impossible to decipher the language. Driven by a mix of fear and an intense, irrational curiosity, Elias reached out and gripped the deadbolt. This time, it turned with ease. The metal clicked, and the door creaked open just an inch, releasing a gust of air that smelled like ozone and old, damp paper. Elias expected to see a dark crawl space or a tangle of copper pipes. Instead, he saw a hallway. But it was not a normal hallway. It was an exact replica of the hallway outside his main apartment door, complete with the same gray industrial carpet and beige wallpaper. However, it did not lead to an exit. It stretched out in both directions for what looked like miles, illuminated by a dim, sourceless yellow glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elias grabbed his heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter and checked his watch. It was 3:17 a.m. He stepped over the threshold and into the corridor, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final thud. He walked for what felt like 10 minutes, passing door after door after door. Every single one of them was identical, and every single one had a small plastic sign that read 404. He tried to open one, then another, but they were all locked tight. The silence of the hallway was only broken by the sound of his own breathing and that growing, rhythmic humming. As he continued to walk, he realized the sound was getting louder, vibrating in his very marrow. He felt a sudden surge of panic and turned around to head back to his apartment. But when he looked back, the door he had entered through was gone. In its place was nothing but more beige wallpaper and another door labeled 404. He was standing in a corridor that had no beginning and no end. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to call 911, but his heart sank when he looked at the device. The screen did not show his wallpaper or his apps. It showed a single, static image of a gray circle. There was no signal, no clock, and no way out. He began to run, his footsteps echoing against the endless gray carpet as he passed 100 more identical doors until he finally saw one that was standing slightly ajar. Elias threw his weight against it and stumbled inside, but as he looked around, the relief he expected to feel was replaced by a cold, numbing terror. Elias stood in the middle of the room, gasping for air as he scanned his surroundings. He found himself standing in his own kitchen. To his left, his half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter exactly where he had left it earlier that evening, the bread starting to curl at the edges. His laptop remained open on the small dining table, the screen glowing softly in the quiet room. A wave of intense relief washed over him, so powerful that his knees felt weak. He figured he had somehow looped back around through the strange architecture of the building and found his way home. He walked over to the sink to splash cold water on his face, trying to wash away the lingering smell of ozone and damp paper. But as he reached for the faucet, he noticed something was wrong. The light in the room was not right. It was not the warm glow of his kitchen lamp or the streetlights from outside. It was that same dim, sourceless yellow hue from the hallway. He looked at the clock on his microwave, expecting to see that it was now nearly 4 a.m. Instead, the digital display did not show numbers at all. It showed the words 404. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He slowly turned toward his laptop. The screen was no longer showing his design project. Every file on his desktop, every icon in the taskbar, and every single line of text in his open documents had been replaced with those same 3 numbers. He grabbed the mouse and tried to click, but the cursor remained frozen. He looked toward the large windows that usually offered a view of the Chicago skyline, but there were no city lights. There were no stars. The sky outside was a dull, static gray, like a television tuned to a dead channel. Elias sat down in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that it was painful. He tried to tell himself he was dreaming, that this was some elaborate night terror brought on by stress, but the texture of the wood under his fingers was too real. He stayed there for hours, or perhaps it was days. Time had ceased to function in any way he understood. The sun never rose, and the gray void outside his window never shifted. He realized with a sinking horror that he had not actually escaped the hallway at all. He had simply entered a version of his life that was missing its soul. In the oppressive silence of this hollow apartment, his mind began to drift toward things he had long ignored. He thought about his parents, whom he had not called in weeks because he was always too busy chasing a deadline. He thought about the neighbor he had passed in the elevator a dozen times without ever saying hello. He realized that he had spent so much of his life looking for the next best thing, the cheaper rent, the higher status, and the better job, that he had stopped paying attention to the reality that actually mattered. He had been so impatient to move into this place because of the price tag that he never once questioned why it was so cheap. He had traded his connection to the real world for a bargain, and now the bargain was all he had left. The silence was eventually broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the humming again, but it was no longer coming from behind the wall. It was coming from everywhere. The sound was deafening now, a physical force that made the walls of his kitchen seem to vibrate and blur. He stood up and walked toward the handleless door, which was now standing wide open, revealing the endless yellow corridor once again. As he stood at the threshold, he realized that the rhythmic vibration he had heard earlier was not just a sound, it was a chorus. The thousands of voices he had heard whispering were not speaking a foreign language. They were saying a name. They were saying his name. Thousands of unseen people were calling for Elias, their voices rising in a feverish, synchronized chant that seemed to pull at the very fabric of his being. He looked back at his half-eaten sandwich and his frozen laptop. He had a choice to make. He could stay in this static, digital tomb until his body eventually faded away into the gray. Or he could go back into the hallway. He could keep walking through the yellow glow, hoping to find the version of reality he had taken for granted, the one filled with messy relationships and expensive rent and the sun rising over the lake. Elias took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and old paper once more. He picked up his heavy flashlight, though its beam felt weak against the sourceless light of the corridor. He stepped back through the small door and onto the gray industrial carpet. This time, he did not just leave the door open. He reached back, grabbed the edge of the wood, and pulled it shut. He turned the deadbolt, locking himself inside the hallway with the whispers. He knew that finding his way back would require a level of patience and sincerity he had never practiced before. He had to want to be home, not for the convenience or the cost, but for the life he had left behind. He began to walk, but the hallway was different now. The doors labeled 404 were no longer silent. From behind each one, he could hear the sound of a life being lived. He heard the muffled sound of a television, the clinking of silverware, and the soft laughter of a family. He stopped in front of one door and reached for the handle, but as his fingers brushed the metal, the whispering stopped instantly. The entire hallway plunged into a darkness so thick he could feel it pressing against his eyes. He clicked his flashlight on, but the beam only traveled a few inches before being swallowed by the gloom. Then, from the darkness further down the hall, he heard the sound of a single pair of footsteps, heavy and slow, walking toward him. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps were rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of heavy leather soles striking the industrial carpet with a terrifying weight. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam was useless, flickering as if the darkness itself were draining the batteries. The humming had returned, but it was no longer a distant whisper. It was a roar that seemed to vibrate inside his skull, a cacophony of his own name being shouted by a legion of voices that sounded exactly like him. He began to backtrack, his hands fumbling along the beige wallpaper as he searched for the door he had just locked. But the wall was smooth and unbroken. There was no deadbolt, no handle, and no narrow wooden frame. The hallway had shifted again, sealing him into this airless void with whatever was approaching from the gloom. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of his failing light. Elias held his breath, the smell of ozone and damp paper now so thick it was nauseating. A voice drifted out of the darkness, but it did not come from the figure in the hall. It came from the other side of the wall, to his right. It was a woman's voice, soft and tired, asking if anyone had seen her keys. Then he heard the sound of a child laughing and the distant melody of a radio playing a song he vaguely remembered from his childhood. These were the sounds of the world he had discarded, the reality he had traded for a cheaper life in a studio apartment. He began to pound on the wallpaper with his fists, screaming for help, but his voice felt thin and hollow, as if it were being absorbed by the yellow glow. Suddenly, the darkness ahead of him broke. A figure stepped into the weak glow of his flashlight. It was not a monster or a ghost. It was a man in his late 60s, wearing a worn cardigan. Arthur, the property manager, stood there with a look of profound sadness on his face. He held a ring of keys in one hand and a heavy deadbolt lock in the other. Arthur did not speak. He simply looked at Elias and shook his head slowly, the way one might look at a stray animal that could not be saved. Arthur reached out and placed a hand on the wall where Elias had been pounding, and with a single fluid motion, he turned an invisible key. A door appeared, and Arthur stepped through it, the light of a normal Chicago afternoon spilling into the hallway for a fraction of a second before the door vanished entirely. Elias was left in total silence. The footsteps were gone. The humming had faded into a dull, background thrum. He looked down at his watch, but the hands were spinning backward at an impossible speed. He realized then that he was no longer a person in a hallway. He was a file that had been misplaced, a line of code that had been corrupted. He was the 404 error in the architecture of the universe. According to the police report filed 3 months later, the apartment of Elias Thorne was found perfectly intact. His phone was still plugged into the charger, and his laptop was running, though the screen was nothing but a field of gray static. His half-eaten sandwich remained on the kitchen counter, having long since turned to a thick green mold. There was no sign of a struggle, and no sign that Elias had ever left the room. The investigators noted the small utility door between the bathroom and the bedroom, but when they broke the lock, they found nothing but a solid brick wall that had been part of the original foundation since 1922. Arthur moved a new tenant into the unit just 2 weeks after the investigation went cold. He gave the same instruction about the humming sound near the kitchen, and he made sure to check the deadbolt on that small, handleless door every single night at 10 p.m. As the new tenant signed the lease, Arthur smiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the narrow door in the corner of the room. Once you decide that the value of your life is measured in what you can save rather than what you can give, you might find yourself in a space where nothing is ever truly earned and nothing can ever truly be kept. We are often so eager to find a shortcut to our dreams that we fail to notice when the path leads us away from our own humanity.
We are taught from a very young age that when something is broken beyond repair, the safest thing to do is throw it away and forget it ever existed. This is especially true in our digital age, where we assume that hitting a delete key or tossing a shattered phone into a bin effectively wipes our slate clean. But the reality of data is much more stubborn. Information does not just vanish into thin air. It hides in the magnetic residue of old platters and lingers in the microscopic circuits of discarded hardware like a memory that refuses to fade. Most of the time, these digital ghosts are harmless, just fragments of old emails or blurry vacation photos. But every once in a while, someone stumbles upon a piece of hardware that was buried for a reason, containing secrets that were never meant to be retrieved from the dark. I am always fascinated by how far these stories reach across the map, so while you are settling in, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the world you are watching from today. In the blistering summer of 2024, a man named Tyler was living in a cluttered but comfortable apartment in Austin, Texas. Tyler was 29 years old and possessed a rare kind of talent for making dead technology breathe again. He was a freelance IT specialist who spent his days deconstructing motherboards and his weekends hunting through estate sales for discarded gems. To Tyler, a pile of dusty electronics was not junk. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. He had a specific obsession with old storage devices, believing that the true history of the world was hidden in the files people thought they had destroyed. One sweltering Saturday morning, Tyler found himself at an estate sale in a sleepy, tree-lined neighborhood on the edge of the city. The house had belonged to a reclusive university professor who had recently passed away without any heirs. The garage was a labyrinth of yellowing textbooks and rusted garden tools, but tucked away in a cardboard box beneath a moth-eaten tarp, Tyler spotted something interesting. It was an industrial-grade external hard drive, encased in a heavy, brushed metal shell that looked like it could survive a plane crash. It was an older model from the early 2010s, and the only marking on it was a single strip of faded masking tape with the number 09 scrawled in black ink. The woman running the sale practically gave it to him for $5 just to get it out of the garage. Tyler headed home, feeling that familiar rush of curiosity. He imagined he might find some old research papers or perhaps a forgotten crypto wallet. But when he sat down at his workbench at 4:15 p.m. and plugged the drive into his recovery rig, the drive did not just mount like a normal device. Instead, it emitted a low, rhythmic thumping sound, like a mechanical heartbeat, and triggered a security prompt that Tyler had never seen before. The encryption was not standard. It was a custom, multi-layered wall of code that seemed designed to keep out everyone but a high-level government agency. For most people, this would have been the end of the road, but for Tyler, it was the ultimate challenge. He spent the next 3 days and nights hunched over his monitors, fueled by black coffee and the thrill of the hunt. He ran brute force scripts and bypassed ancient security protocols, slowly peeling back the layers of the professor's digital fortress. Finally, on a Tuesday night at exactly 11:42 p.m., the drive gave a loud metallic click. A single folder appeared on his desktop titled Archives. Inside that folder, Tyler found dozens of video files, all time-stamped from 15 years ago. He scrolled through them, seeing mundane clips of the professor in his office or walking through the woods. But his mouse hovered over a file that stood out from the rest. It was titled File 09, and unlike the others, it had a massive file size that made no sense for its duration. Tyler clicked play. The video opened with a shaky, handheld shot of a deep industrial basement. The walls were unfinished concrete, stained with patches of dampness. In the center of the frame stood a heavy wooden chair facing a blank gray wall. The professor walked into the shot, looking significantly younger but terribly frail. His eyes were sunken, and his skin had a translucent, waxy quality. He set the camera on a tripod and sat down, staring directly into the lens with a look of profound exhaustion. He began to speak in a low, monotone whisper. He claimed that after decades of research into bioelectric frequencies, he had found a way to bridge the gap between human perception and the things that occupy the space between seconds. He explained that by disrupting the alpha waves of the brain with a specific sequence of light and sound, the veil of reality would simply dissolve. Tyler watched, mesmerized, as the professor reached off camera and flipped a switch. The lights in the video went out, plunging the basement into near-total darkness, save for a faint, pulsing red glow from a machine nearby. A low, vibrating hum began to bleed through Tyler's headphones. It was a sound that did not feel like it was coming from the speakers. It felt like it was vibrating inside his own skull. In the video, the professor sat perfectly still for 10 minutes. The silence was suffocating. Then the video feed began to ripple. It looked like heat rising off a highway, a distortion in the air that started near the ceiling and slowly drifted toward the sitting man. As the ripple touched the professor's shoulder, the audio distorted into a sharp metallic whine. The professor did not move, but Tyler noticed something that made his blood run cold. Even though the professor was sitting with his hands resting on his knees, the shadow on the concrete wall behind him was standing up. The shadow was a jagged, spindly thing with limbs that were far too long to be human. It leaned over the professor, its head splitting open to reveal a row of needle-like teeth that seemed to be made of pure, flickering static. The shadow reached out a long, dark finger and touched the back of the professor's neck. At that exact moment, the professor in the video did not scream. He simply looked into the camera, his eyes wide with a soul-crushing realization, and whispered that they had been waiting for someone to look. Suddenly, Tyler's monitors flickered, the video cut to black, but the low humming sound in his headphones did not stop. It got louder. Tyler reached up to pull the headphones off, but as he did, he glanced at the darkened window of his office. In the reflection of the glass, he could see himself sitting at his desk. But standing directly behind his chair was a tall, shivering pillar of static that had not been there a second ago. He whipped around to face the empty room, but there was nothing there. When he turned back to the window, the reflection of the entity was gone, but his own reflection remained, and it was no longer blinking. Tyler sat frozen in his chair, the plastic of his headphones still gripped in his trembling fingers. The silence in the apartment was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against his eardrums. He slowly turned his head back toward the monitors, his eyes darting to every shadow in the room. There was nothing there. No pillar of static, no spindly shadow, just the familiar clutter of his workbench and the glowing blue power light of his PC. He told himself that his mind was playing tricks on him after 3 days of no sleep and too much caffeine. The brain is a powerful engine, he reasoned, and when it runs on fumes, it starts to misfire. He reached out and closed the video player, but the archives folder stayed open on his desktop. He wanted to delete it, to format the drive and throw the whole metal casing into the river, but a dark magnetic pull kept his hand on the mouse. He noticed that after watching File 09, a new file had appeared at the bottom of the list. It was titled Current Stream, and the timestamp was exactly 11:59 p.m. That was less than 1 minute ago. Tyler clicked it. The screen flickered to life, but it was not a recording from 15 years ago. It was a high-definition feed of a room he recognized instantly. It was his own living room, taken from the perspective of the bookshelf where his smart speaker sat. He watched himself on the screen, sitting in the office chair just a few feet away. The video was crisp, far better than any consumer camera he owned. He saw himself reach up and wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead. The terror that washed over him was cold and absolute. He did not own a camera in his living room. He checked his network logs, his hand shaking so violently he could barely type. There were no new devices connected, no hidden IP cameras, no unauthorized streams. Yet, on the monitor, the video continued to play in real time. As he watched the feed, he saw a distortion ripple across the screen, starting from the hallway that led to his bedroom. It was the same heat haze effect from the professor's video. The ripple moved slowly, purposefully, toward the back of the chair where Tyler was currently sitting. In the video, the tall, jagged entity made of static emerged from the darkness of the hallway. It looked like a tear in the digital fabric of the world, a vibrating silhouette that sucked the light out of the air around it. On the screen, the static figure reached out a long, needle-like finger toward the back of Tyler's neck. In the physical room, Tyler felt a sudden, sharp, prickling sensation on his skin. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles of ice were being driven into the base of his skull. He let out a choked gasp and lunged forward, knocking his keyboard off the desk as he scrambled toward the door. He did not look back. He ran into the hallway, fumbling for his car keys on the small table by the entrance. The air in the hallway was freezing, and the scent of ozone was so strong it made his eyes water. He threw open the front door and ran into the humid Texas night, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He got into his car and drove. He did not have a destination, he just needed distance. He drove toward the bright lights of downtown Austin, seeking the safety of crowds and the hum of city life. He ended up at a 24-hour diner on Congress Avenue at 2:15 a.m. He sat in a vinyl booth under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes glued to the entrance. He felt like a man who had just escaped a burning building, but the smoke was still in his lungs. He took out his phone to call the police, but what was he going to say? That he found a haunted hard drive. That a digital ghost was watching him through a camera that did not exist. They would put him in a psych ward before he finished the story. He opened his phone to check his bank account, just to ground himself in something normal and mundane. But when the screen turned on, his wallpaper was gone. In its place was a still frame from the video he had just seen. It was the shot of the static entity standing directly behind him in his office. Underneath the image, a text box appeared. It was not a standard notification. It was a line of white text against a black background that read, "Information wants to be seen." Tyler dropped the phone on the table as if it had turned into a snake. The screen stayed lit, the red eye of the entity in the photo appearing to pulse with a rhythmic, mechanical light. He realized then that the hard drive was not just a storage device, it was an anchor. By breaking the encryption, he had not just accessed the data, he had given it a pathway into his own digital life. Every device he owned, every account he signed into, was now a window for whatever the professor had invited in. He sat in the diner for hours, watching the sun rise over the city. He felt a deep, gnawing sense of regret. He had been so arrogant, thinking he could master any system, but he had ignored the oldest rule of the dark. Some locks are not there to keep people out. They are there to keep something else in. At 7:45 a.m., Tyler decided he had to go back. He could not run forever, and his entire life was tied to those machines. He needed to destroy the drive and wipe every server he had access to. He drove back to his apartment, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. When he reached his floor and walked down the hallway, he noticed his front door was slightly ajar. He was certain he had slammed it shut in his panic. He pushed it open slowly, his breath hitching in his throat. The apartment was silent, the lights were off. He walked into his office and stopped dead. His computer was off, the monitors black and cold. But sitting in the middle of his desk, right where his keyboard had been, was the industrial hard drive. It was no longer plugged in. The cables were neatly coiled next to it, and on top of the metal casing there was a new piece of masking tape. The number 09 had been crossed out with a single black line, and underneath it, in handwriting that looked exactly like Tyler's, was a new number, 10. As Tyler stared at the drive, a low, pulsing hum began to rise from the floorboards beneath his feet. He looked toward his closet door, which was slowly, silently beginning to creak open from the inside. The closet door continued its agonizingly slow pivot, the hinges groaning with a sound that mimicked a human whimper. Tyler stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the growing sliver of darkness behind the wood. The pulsing hum from the floorboards grew into a physical vibration, a heavy mechanical throb that made his vision blur in sync with the noise. He tried to move his legs, to turn and run back out into the hallway, but his muscles felt as though they had been fused to the floor by an immense magnetic force. As the closet door swung fully open, Tyler saw that his clothes were gone. His jackets, his shirts, and the boxes of spare parts he kept on the floor had been replaced by a wall of dense, flickering static that seemed to be pouring out of the very architecture of the building. In the center of that digital haze stood a figure. It was the professor, or at least it was the shape of the professor. His body was translucent and gray, his skin rippling with the same heat haze distortion Tyler had seen on the video. The professor's eyes were wide and white, glowing with a soft, internal light. He did not speak, but the air around him began to resonate with 1,000 overlapping voices, all of them whispering lines of code and fragmented memories. The professor raised a hand, his fingers elongating into those terrible, needle-like points, and pointed directly at the metal hard drive sitting on Tyler's desk. Tyler looked at the drive. The new masking tape with the number 10 seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. He realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that the number was not a file count, it was a sequence. The professor had been number 9, Tyler was now number 10. The data did not just want to be seen, it wanted a host. It needed a physical vessel to anchor its existence in a world of flesh and bone. Suddenly, every electronic device in the room roared to life without being touched. His monitors displayed a blinding white light, his speakers emitted a high-pitched shriek that sounded like grinding metal, and his phone began to vibrate so violently it danced across the desk. The static from the closet began to spill outward, crawling across the carpet like a tide of liquid mercury. It touched Tyler's shoes, and he felt a surge of electricity so powerful it threw his head back and locked his jaw. He watched in horror as his own hands began to flicker. His skin turned a dull ashen gray, and for a split second he could see the bones beneath his flesh not as calcium, but as glowing copper filaments. He tried to scream, but the only sound that came out of his throat was a burst of white noise. He was being converted, he was being compressed, and encrypted into the very system he had spent his life trying to master. The professor stepped forward, his form merging with Tyler's. As they collided, the apartment around them began to dissolve into a vortex of pixels and light. The walls, the desk, the books, everything was being pulled into the metal casing of the hard drive. Tyler felt his consciousness splintering into millions of tiny fragments of data, each one a memory being filed away into a cold, dark archive. His last thought was a vision of the estate sale garage, wondering who would be the one to find the drive next. When the property manager finally entered the apartment 3 weeks later to investigate the unpaid rent, he found the place in an impossible state. It was not messy or burglarized. It was completely empty. There was no furniture, no clothes, and no computer equipment. The carpet was pristine, and the walls looked as though they had been freshly painted. The only item in the entire apartment was a single, heavy external hard drive sitting in the exact center of the floor. The manager picked it up, noting its weight and the industrial metal casing. He saw a piece of masking tape on it with the number 10 written in a neat professional hand. He figured it was worth a few dollars on the secondary market and tossed it into his bag, planning to wipe it and sell it on a local marketplace later that evening. As he walked out and locked the door, the digital clock on the kitchen stove, the only thing he had missed, suddenly flickered. The time changed from 10:45 a.m. to 3:33 a.m., and the display began to count backward with a frantic, blurring speed. We live in an era where we trust technology to hold our history, our secrets, and our identities, believing that a password or a delete key gives us total authority over our digital footprint. But we often forget that once we invite a force into our lives, we no longer control the terms of its stay. Curiosity is a powerful tool for discovery, but when it is not tempered with a respect for the things meant to stay hidden, it can easily become the very thing that erases us. The world is full of forgotten boxes and discarded drives, each one a silent witness, waiting for a fresh set of eyes to give it life again. I think I will stay away from the estate sales for a while. There are some puzzles that simply do not want to be solved.
Imagine walking into a freezing, dark cabin in the middle of an isolated forest. You are shivering, uncontrollably, starving and terrified. Right in front of you, stacked neatly on the shelves, is enough food to last an entire year. Just outside the door is a full propane tank connected to a heater inside the room. All you have to do is turn a small valve, strike a single match, or open a can of food. But instead of saving your own life, you just lie down in the freezing dark, pull a blanket up to your chin, and slowly waste away. This is not a hypothetical scenario from a horror movie. This is exactly what happened in one of the most baffling, unsettling, and heartbreaking mysteries in American history. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a story format, you have come to the right place. Please take a moment to gently tap the like button and subscribe so you never miss out on these unsettling stories. It was the evening of February 24th, 1978. 5 best friends from Yuba City, California, were piling into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. The air was brisk, but the men were entirely consumed by excitement. These men were Ted Weyer, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, and Bill Sterling. They ranged in age from 24 to 32, and they were a very unique group of friends. Each of them had some form of mild cognitive disability or psychiatric condition, but they were high-functioning, held down jobs, lived safely at home with their parents, and shared an intense, unbreakable bond over one single passion. That passion was basketball. They had formed their own team called the Gateway Gators. The very next day, they were scheduled to play their first game in a regional Special Olympics tournament. The stakes were incredibly high in their eyes, as the winning team would get a free week-long trip to Los Angeles. They were so thrilled about the tournament that some of them had already carefully laid out their freshly washed uniforms on their beds before leaving the house that evening. They wanted to be completely ready for the morning, but tonight they were taking a short road trip. They were driving 50 miles north to the town of Chico to watch a college basketball game. Jack Madruga was behind the wheel. He loved his car fiercely and drove it with extreme, almost overly cautious care. The college game was lively, and the boys had a fantastic time cheering from the bleachers. The game ended around 10 p.m. Afterward, the group stopped at a small local market just down the street from the gymnasium. The store clerk vividly remembered them. They were cheerful and polite, buying Hostess cherry pies, candy bars, and sodas to snack on during the ride back. It was about 10:30 p.m. when they walked out of the brightly lit store, got back into the Mercury Montego, and drove off into the dark California night. They were supposed to head south, taking a straight, easy, and very familiar highway directly back to Yuba City. Their parents expected them to be home safely in their beds by midnight at the absolute latest. But midnight came and went. The house phones remained silent. The boys did not return. By 6 a.m. the next morning, the parents were awake and frantically calling each other's houses. By 8 a.m., the police had been notified. The authorities initially tried to calm the parents down, suggesting the men had simply taken a detour, perhaps deciding to stay over at a friend's house or got a flat tire. But the mothers and fathers knew better. These 5 men were strict creatures of habit. They never missed a curfew without calling home, and more importantly, they would never, ever risk missing their big basketball tournament that morning. For them to miss the game they had trained months for, something had to be horribly, terribly wrong. Days turned into a week, and a massive search effort across the local highways yielded absolutely nothing. It was as if the turquoise car and the 5 men had vanished off the face of the earth. Then, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the terror. A park ranger reported seeing an abandoned car parked on a remote, unpaved logging road deep inside the Plumas National Forest. The location made absolutely no sense. The car was found 70 miles away from Chico, in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It was high up in the mountains, at a freezing elevation of 4,400 feet. The police rushed to the scene immediately, It was indeed Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego. When investigators arrived at the vehicle, the clues they found shattered every logical theory they had. The car was sitting perfectly upright on the snow-covered dirt road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of any kind of accident or struggle. The keys were missing, but when the police hot-wired the ignition, the engine roared to life immediately. The gas tank was a quarter full. The tires were in perfect condition. The car was slightly bogged down in a shallow snowdrift, but 5 grown men could have easily pushed it out in less than a minute. Even more bizarre, the candy wrappers and empty soda cans from the market in Chico were neatly folded and left inside the cabin. But there was no trace of the 5 men. The authorities were completely baffled. Why would Jack Madruga, a man who hated driving on unfamiliar roads and treated his car like a prized possession, drive up a treacherous, winding, unpaved mountain road in the dead of winter? They were far from home, heading into absolute wilderness, wearing clothes meant for a mild California evening indoors. They were dressed in light windbreakers, jeans, and low-top sneakers. The temperature up on that mountain was plummeting toward 0 degrees. And why, when the car got slightly stuck, did they abandon a perfectly working vehicle that could have provided shelter, safety, and a functioning heater? Shortly after the car was found, the police received a deeply disturbing tip. A local man named Joseph Shones came forward with a story that sounded like a nightmare. He told police that on the exact night the men went missing, he was driving his own truck up that very same logging road. He was looking for the snow line because he wanted to bring his family up for a ski trip that coming weekend. His truck got deeply stuck in the snow. While he was outside, violently shoveling the snow trying to free his tires, he experienced a sudden, massive heart attack. Lying inside his freezing truck, writhing in excruciating pain and entirely convinced he was going to die right there on the mountain, he suddenly saw headlights illuminating the trees from down the road. It was around 11:30 p.m. He saw a car park a short distance behind him. He heard the muffled sound of voices drifting through the freezing air. Desperate for his life, Shones pushed his door open, stepped out of his truck, and yelled for help at the top of his lungs. Through the blinding glare of the headlights, he claimed he saw a group of men, and strangely, a woman holding a baby. But the very moment he called out to them, the voices instantly stopped. The headlights were abruptly shut off. The pitch-black woods went dead silent. Shones called out again, pleading for them to help a dying man. He received absolutely no answer. It was as if the group had dissolved into the shadows. Shones eventually managed to survive the night and painfully walked back down the mountain the next morning to get help. His story baffled investigators. The footprints around Madruga's abandoned car perfectly matched the 5 missing men. But who was the woman with the baby? And why on earth would these 5 friendly, gentle men completely ignore a dying man screaming for help in the pitch-black woods? Before the police could launch a full-scale ground search of the deep forest, severe winter storms battered the mountain range. A brutal blizzard dumped snow continuously for weeks, piling up to 15 feet high in some areas. The search had to be entirely called off. It was too dangerous for the rescue teams. The parents of the 5 men were left in a state of agonizing, unending limbo. Months slowly passed. The heavy snow slowly began to melt as the warmth of spring finally arrived. In early June, exactly 114 days after the men disappeared into the night, a small group of motorcyclists were riding their dirt bikes on a very rough, remote trail deep inside the forest. They were nearly 20 miles uphill from the spot where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came out into a clearing and stumbled upon a United States Forest Service trailer. It was a small, heavy-duty cabin used by park rangers during the summer months. The bikers noticed that the front window of the trailer had been violently broken out. Curious and slightly uneasy, they parked their bikes and looked inside the shattered window. The overwhelming smell of decay hit them first. Then, peering into the gloom, they saw the body. It was Ted Wire. He was lying squarely on a bed, completely wrapped from head to toe in 8 thick sleeping bags and heavy blankets. He was severely emaciated, his body reduced to a skeleton covered in skin, and his feet were completely ruined by severe frostbite. The bikers fled in terror and notified the authorities. When investigators swarmed the remote trailer a few hours later, the scene they documented inside made absolutely no logical sense. It defied human survival instincts. Forensic analysis revealed that Ted Wire had lived inside that dark, freezing trailer for up to 3 agonizing months after the night he went missing. His thick beard growth and the extreme loss of body weight indicated he had survived for many weeks, slowly and painfully starving and freezing to death. But the trailer was fully stocked with emergency supplies. All around the room were heavy winter coats, insulated boots, and extra sleeping bags, all left completely untouched. There was a large propane tank sitting right outside the trailer, directly connected to a large space heater inside. All Ted or his friends had to do was reach out and turn a simple metal valve to flood the room with life-saving heat. The valve was never turned. There were dozens of paperback books, paper materials, and wooden furniture that could have easily been used to start a fire in the fireplace. There were dry matches sitting right on the table in plain sight. No fire was ever made. But the most horrifying discovery of all was the food supply. In a small storage shed directly attached to the outside of the trailer, there was enough freeze-dried food, canned vegetables, fruits, and heavy military rations to comfortably feed all 5 men for an entire year. Investigators found that a tiny handful of cans had been opened and eaten. They were opened with a specialized military P-38 can opener. Gary Mathias, the only Army veteran in the group, was known to carry this exact type of can opener on his keychain. But after those first few cans, the men just stopped eating. The rest of the massive food hoard, literally an arm's length away from where Ted lay dying, was left completely untouched. Ted Wire, a man who weighed over 200 pounds when he vanished after the basketball game, weighed just 73 pounds when he was found wrapped in those blankets. He had slowly starved to death in a room absolutely overflowing with food. The police immediately fanned out to search the surrounding wilderness. Within a few days, the grim discoveries continued. They found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling in a deep drainage ditch along the dirt road leading up to the trailer. Autopsies showed they had died of extreme hypothermia while attempting the grueling 20-mile hike up the mountain in the pitch dark. Further deep into the dense woods, searchers found the scattered, animal-scavenged bones of Jack Hewitt. His jeans and shoes were left nearby, and his father's heavy jacket, which he had been proudly wearing that night, was found discarded miles away. But Gary Mathias, the Army veteran and the most capable survivor of the group, was never found. The only trace of him was his low-top tennis shoes, which were found sitting neatly inside the trailer next to Ted's bed. It appeared that after Ted passed away, or perhaps shortly before, Gary put on Ted's heavier, warmer leather boots, stepped out of the trailer into the unforgiving winter wilderness, and walked away into oblivion. He was never seen or heard from again. The tragedy of the Yuba County Five leaves behind a chilling, impenetrable wall of questions. What terrifying thing drove these 5 men to abandon a perfectly safe working car and march 20 miles uphill through deep, freezing snow into total darkness, wearing nothing but light jackets? Why did they ignore Joseph Shones as he begged for his life? And, most hauntingly, why did the survivors, who actually reached the safety of the trailer, refuse to use the heat, the fire, or the massive pile of food that could have easily saved their lives? Psychologists and investigators have theorized for decades. Some believe the men saw something illegal or terrifying happening on that logging road, perhaps related to the mysterious woman and baby that Shones claimed to have seen. Maybe they genuinely believed they were being hunted in the dark. Their specific cognitive challenges might have caused them to panic entirely, their minds unable to process the fear, leading them to make highly irrational decisions. When they finally reached the Forest Service trailer after hiking for days in the snow, they had to break a window to get inside. It is highly likely they were so deeply afraid of getting in trouble with the law for breaking and entering into government property that their rigid minds refused to allow them to touch the supplies. They might have huddled together in the freezing dark, paralyzed by rules and fear, simply waiting for someone to come save them, until the bitter, cold, and unrelenting hunger slowly took them one by one. Ted Viher, known by his family to lack common sense, but possessing an incredibly gentle soul, might have simply stayed in the bed where his friends tucked him in, patiently waiting for Gary to bring back help that would never arrive. There is a quiet, haunting beauty and immense tragedy in their final days. They never turned on each other. The ones who made it to the cabin tried their best to care for Ted. They tucked him into bed. They wrapped him in every blanket they could find. They stayed by his side in the dark. It speaks to a profound truth about life. Sometimes the most innocent, trusting, and gentle souls among us are the most vulnerable to the chaotic, unforgiving nature of the world. Life demands a harsh adaptability. A single wrong turn in the dark, a moment of blinding panic, or a stubborn adherence to the rules, even when survival is on the line, can lead to devastating consequences. Their story is a stark reminder that the wilderness does not care about your good intentions, your fears, or your innocence. The physical world is entirely indifferent. The thick mountain forest swallowed their final moments, keeping the true, horrifying sequence of events locked permanently beneath the winter snow. The parents of the 5 men lived out the rest of their days consumed by the agonizing question of what chased their boys up that mountain. And Gary Mathias remains missing to this very day, a ghost wandering the Plumas National Forest. The strange case of the Yuba County 5 remains one of the darkest, most impenetrable mysteries of the American outdoors. There are many more stories hidden in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps the next one will chill you even deeper to the bone. There is a very specific type of terror that comes from something that simply cannot happen. We are accustomed to tragedy, and we can process violence or accidents because they leave evidence behind. They leave a trail of cause and effect that our brains can understand. But what happens when the physical laws of our reality just seem to break? Imagine a room with only one door. You set up a camera pointing directly at that door. You watch a person walk through that door into the room. A few minutes later, you watch every single person inside that room walk back out. But the person you watched go in is not among them. You search the room, and it is completely empty. Where did they go? Did they dissolve into the air? Did they step into a crack in the universe? Ah. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what happened to a young man in Ohio, in a case that remains one of the most baffling, logically impossible mysteries ever recorded. Before we dive into the impossible vanishing of this young man, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2006. The city was Columbus, Ohio. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old, and on the surface, his life was moving in a brilliant direction. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a bright, handsome, and deeply intelligent young man with a promising future as a doctor. He had a beautiful girlfriend named Alexis, who was also a medical student, and they were deeply in love. In fact, Brian had recently purchased a ring and was planning to ask Alexis to marry him during an upcoming vacation they had booked to Miami, Florida. They were scheduled to fly out on a Monday, just a few days away. But underneath the surface of this perfect life, Brian was carrying a heavy, suffocating weight. Just 3 weeks prior to this story, Brian had lost his mother to a grueling battle with cancer. He had been incredibly close to her, and her death had left a massive, hollow void in his heart. He was trying to hold it together, pushing through his grueling medical exams and keeping a brave face for his family and Alexis. But the grief was a constant, heavy shadow following him everywhere. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, Brian finished his final medical exams for the quarter. It was the beginning of spring break. He and his father went out to dinner that evening. His father noticed that Brian looked exhausted. The late nights of studying, combined with the raw, unprocessed grief of losing his mother, were clearly taking a toll on him. His father told him he should just go home, get some rest, and pack for his trip to Miami. But Brian declined. He said he was going to meet up with his friend and fellow medical student, Clint, to celebrate the end of their exams. He needed a distraction. He needed to blow off some steam. Around 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona. This location is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer impossibility of what was about to happen. The Ugly Tuna Saloona was located inside a large entertainment complex in the University District, but the bar was not on the ground floor. It was located on the second floor of the building. To get into the bar, you had to walk into the ground floor lobby and ride a long escalator up to the second level. At the top of the escalator, there was a small landing and then the main entrance doors leading into the bar. Most importantly, the building was equipped with security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling right outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. This camera continuously panned back and forth, capturing the top of the escalator, the landing, and the front doors of the bar. It was the only public entrance and the only public exit. If you went into the bar, you were caught on that camera. If you left the bar, you were caught on that camera. Brian and Clint started their night at the Ugly Tuna. They had a few drinks, catching up and enjoying the loud, energetic atmosphere of the college crowd. After a while, they decided to do some bar hopping. They left the Ugly Tuna, went back down the escalator, and visited a few other establishments in the immediate area. They drank, they talked to friends, and they tried to drown out the heavy stress of the past few weeks. As the night wore on, they met up with a female friend named Meredith. The three of them continued their night out, eventually deciding to head back to where they started. At 1:15 a.m., early Saturday morning on April 1st, the security camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloona captured Brian, Clint, and Meredith riding the escalator back up to the second floor. The footage shows them clearly. They step off the escalator, walk across the landing, and disappear through the doors into the crowded bar. The bar was incredibly packed. The music was deafening. The air was hot and humid from hundreds of bodies pressing together, and the drinks were flowing. Clint and Meredith found a spot near the bar, but Brian told them he was going to walk around and see if he could find some other friends. He wandered off into the dense crowd, disappearing into the sea of people. Time slipped away. At 1:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before the bar was scheduled to close for the night, the security camera outside the entrance captured Brian once again. The footage shows Brian stepping out of the front doors of the bar. He walks onto the landing near the top of the escalator. He is talking to two young women. They stand there for a brief moment, chatting. Brian looks totally normal. He is not stumbling. He does not look distressed, and he does not seem to be in any kind of danger. He says goodbye to the two women. The women turn and walk toward the escalator to leave the building. Brian, however, does not follow them. The camera clearly shows him turn around, face the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and walk back toward the doors. He steps out of the frame, heading directly back into the bar. At 2 a.m., the harsh, bright, overhead lights of the Ugly Tuna Saloona turned on. The music abruptly cut off. The bartenders started shouting for everyone to finish their drinks and head toward the exit. It was closing time. Clint and Meredith were standing near the front, waiting for Brian. As the massive crowd began to funnel out of the doors and down the escalator, they kept their eyes peeled for their friend. They watched hundreds of college students shuffle past them. The crowd slowly thinned out until the bar was completely empty. The staff began wiping down the tables and sweeping the floors, but Brian never came out. Clint and Meredith checked the bathrooms. They were empty. They walked around the entire second-floor landing. Nothing. Clint tried calling Brian's cell phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and assuming that Brian had perhaps met up with someone else and left without telling them, or simply decided to walk home to his apartment, Clint and Meredith gave up. They walked down the escalator and went home. Saturday morning arrived. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, called him several times, eager to talk about their trip to Miami. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She thought it was slightly strange, but she figured he was just sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. As the day progressed into evening, and Brian still had not returned any calls from Alexis, Clint, or his father, a cold sense of unease began to settle over the family. Brian was not the type of person to completely ignore his phone, especially not with a major trip coming up. By Sunday, the unease had turned into pure panic. Brian had a flight to catch on Monday morning. He had not been home. His car was still parked at his apartment. His luggage was not packed. Monday morning came. Alexis stood at the airport departure gate in absolute agony, watching the passengers board the flight to Miami. She waited until the very last second, praying she would see Brian running down the terminal. But he never showed up. The plane doors closed, and the plane took off without him. At that exact moment, Alexis knew something was horribly wrong. The family immediately contacted the Columbus police and officially reported Brian Schaefer missing. The police launched an investigation, initially assuming this was a standard case of a young man who had perhaps wandered off and gotten into an accident. They requested the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, focusing entirely on the night of Friday, March 31st, and the early hours of Saturday, April 1st. The detectives sat in a dark room. Watching the grainy footage, they saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith ride the escalator up at 1:15 a.m. They fast-forwarded. They watched the footage at 1:55 a.m. They saw Brian walk out, talk to the two women, turn around, and walk back toward the bar entrance. Then, the detectives watched the footage from 2 a.m. until the bar was completely empty. They watched every single person walk out of those doors and go down the escalator. They paused the tape, they rewound it, they watched it again. They focused on every face, every jacket, every gate. Brian Schaefer never walked out. The detectives were baffled. They thought they must have missed something. They implemented a painstaking manual counting process. They counted every single person who went up the escalator that night. Then they counted every single person who came down the escalator. The numbers did not lie. Every single person who went up that night came back down, except for one, Brian. How does a 27-year-old man vanish from a second-floor bar with only one public exit? The police immediately secured the building. They brought in highly trained search dogs. The dogs were given a piece of Brian's unwashed clothing to pick up his scent. The dogs tracked his scent through the ground floor lobby, up the escalator, across the landing, and into the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The dogs wandered around the bar floor, following his path through the crowd. But then, the scent just stopped. The dogs spun in circles, confused. They could not find a trail leading out. It was as if Brian had evaporated into thin air right there on the bar floor. The authorities began to look for alternative exits. If he did not go down the escalator, he had to have left through another door. The only other way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloon was a set of emergency service doors located in the back of the building. These doors were strictly for staff and deliveries. The police investigated the service doors. If Brian had somehow slipped through them without anyone noticing, he would have found himself in a chaotic, highly dangerous environment. The back of the building was a massive, active construction site. It was dark, filled with deep trenches, exposed rebar, concrete pillars, and steep drops. It was a labyrinth of scaffolding and debris. But there was a major problem with this theory. The service doors were not meant for public use. They were heavy, and they opened up to a route that was notoriously difficult to navigate even in the daylight. More importantly, the construction site was heavily monitored by motion-sensitive security cameras to prevent theft. The police pulled every single hour of footage from the construction site cameras for that entire weekend. They watched the tapes, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow, any sign of a person stumbling through the dark. The motion sensors were never tripped. The cameras captured absolutely nothing. Furthermore, police scoured the entire construction zone. They brought the tracking dogs through the debris. They looked down every trench and inside every concrete pipe. They found zero physical evidence that anyone had been there. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no footprints in the mud. The situation was entirely impossible. He did not leave through the front. He did not leave through the back. He was not inside the bar. Desperation set in. Prevent. The police theorized that perhaps Brian had changed his clothes to disguise himself and slipped past the front camera. They meticulously interviewed every single person who was in the bar that night. They tracked down the two women he was seen speaking to at 1:55 a.m. The women confirmed they spoke to him briefly, said goodbye, and left. They had no idea where he went afterward. They checked Brian's bank accounts, his credit cards, and his cell phone records. After the night he vanished, his phone never pinged another cell tower. His credit cards were never swiped. His bank accounts remained completely untouched. He had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The disappearance of Brian Schaefer became a national obsession. It is the ultimate locked room mystery playing out in real life. People analyzed the footage frame by frame, suggesting wild theories. Some believed that Brian, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his mother and the pressure of medical school, had meticulously planned his own disappearance, finding an unseen blind spot in the camera system to escape and start a new life. But his family entirely rejected this. Brian loved Alexis. He was about to propose. He loved his father and his brother. He would never inflict that kind of agonizing pain on them, especially so soon after his mother's death. Others believed he met with foul play inside the bar. They suggested that an altercation occurred in the back rooms, and his body was somehow smuggled out in a trash bin or hidden within the walls of the construction site before the concrete was poured. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete pillars of the new construction, desperate to find an anomaly that might be a human body. The radar found nothing. The ugly tuna saloona eventually closed its doors permanently, but the mystery of what happened inside that building continues to haunt anyone who hears it. This story forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about our lives. We spend all our time building foundations. We go to school, we plan vacations, we buy rings for the people we love, and we operate under the absolute assumption that tomorrow is a guaranteed event. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid. But life is an incredibly fragile, unpredictable current. The physical world can shift in ways we cannot comprehend. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the sincerity of our connections. We never truly know when the last time we speak to someone will be. We never know when a simple goodbye will become a permanent silence. The grief that Brian's family endured, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a door to open that remained shut forever, is a stark reminder to hold the people we care about close. It is a reminder to live with patience, to express our love sincerely, and to never let a disagreement linger into the night, because the universe does not owe us closure. It does not owe us an explanation. Sometimes, the people we love the most simply step out of the frame, and we are left staring at an empty room for the rest of our lives. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive, isolated mountain range where a young boy vanished into thin air, only to be found days later miles away, telling a story about a creature that defies every law of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. We upload at least 3 of these stories every single week. So if that is something you are into, please go ahead and invite the like button over for a nice dinner, but then insist on eating in total silence while staring directly at their forehead. Tonight, we are looking at a case that takes place in a small, quiet town in the Pacific Northwest called Oak Haven. It is the kind of place where people move to get away from the noise of Seattle or Portland. It is surrounded by thick, ancient forests that seem to swallow the light, and for most people who live there, the biggest drama is usually a fallen tree or a local deer getting into someone's garden. But for a woman named Sarah Jenkins, Oak Haven was about to become the setting of a mystery that would defy everything she knew about reality. It was 11:45 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in October 2025. Sarah was sitting in a dimly lit, high-tech room at the Oak Haven Emergency Communications Center. She was a veteran emergency dispatcher, someone who had heard it all. She had talked people through heart attacks, guided fathers through delivering babies in the back of minivans, and calmed down frantic callers during house fires. She was calm, professional, and almost impossible to rattle. The night shift was usually slow. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the cooling fans from the computer towers and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Sarah was sipping a lukewarm cup of black coffee, staring at her monitors, waiting for the next call to come in. At exactly midnight, her console lit up. A call was coming through. Sarah adjusted her headset, clicked her mouse to accept the line, and gave her standard greeting. 911. What is your emergency? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. All Sarah could hear was a faint, static hiss and the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. It sounded like someone was running, or perhaps they were in extreme pain. Hello? This is 911. Do you have an emergency? Sarah repeated. Her voice steady but firm. Finally, a voice came through, but it was not screaming. It was a whisper, a woman's voice, trembling with a level of terror that Sarah had never encountered in her 10 years on the job. You have to help me, the voice said. He is inside. He is coming up the stairs right now. Sarah immediately went into professional mode. Her fingers began flying across the keyboard. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address? There was a loud thud on the other end of the line, like a door being kicked in. The caller let out a muffled sob. 142 North Maple Drive, the woman whispered. My name is Sarah Jenkins. Please, he has a knife. He is at the door. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a second, the entire room seemed to tilt. 142 North Maple Drive was not just a random address. It was her address, and Sarah Jenkins was her name. She looked at the caller ID display on her screen. Usually, it would show a phone number or a GPS coordinate. But tonight, the box for the caller information was blank, except for a timestamp that sat at the very bottom of the metadata. It read, October 29th, 2025, 12:10 a.m. Sarah looked at the clock on her wall. It was currently midnight on October 28th. According to her system, this call was coming from 10 minutes in the future. She felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. She thought it was a prank, perhaps a coworker playing a cruel joke. But the voice on the other end did not sound like a recording. It sounded exactly like her. The cadence, the slight rasp in the throat, the way she pronounced her S's, it was her own voice, screaming in a future that had not happened yet. "Ma'am, who is this?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking for the first time in her career. "I told you, it is Sarah. He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh, God, please." Then a sickening sound came through the headset. It was a wet, tearing noise, followed by a sharp, guttural cry that was cut off abruptly. There was a heavy thud, the sound of something hitting a carpeted floor, and then the line went dead. Sarah sat in total silence. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked around the dispatch center, but the other dispatcher on duty, a man named Dave, was in the break room getting a snack. She was alone. She looked at the clock again. It was 12:02 a.m. She had 8 minutes. Her mind was racing. If that call was real, someone was going to break into her house in 8 minutes and kill her. But she was here, at work. She was safe behind locked doors and security cameras. How could she be at her house and at the dispatch center at the same time? Then she remembered. She was supposed to have stayed home tonight. She had traded shifts with Dave at the last minute because she wanted to finish a project at the office. If she had stayed home, she would be at 142 North Maple Drive right now. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed her home security system. She had cameras in the living room and the hallway. She opened the app, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. The feed loaded slowly. The living room was dark and quiet. Everything looked normal. She checked the clock on the camera feed. 12:04 a.m. She began to tell herself that it had to be a prank. Some hacker must have found a way to spoof the 911 system and use an AI voice generator to mimic her. It was the only logical explanation. But as she watched the screen, she saw a shadow move across the back patio. A man was standing outside her glass sliding door. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and a mask that obscured his face. In his right hand, he held a long, serrated kitchen knife. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was not a prank. She watched as the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed it against the glass, and a second later, the entire sliding door shattered silently. He stepped into her living room. Sarah did not hesitate. She picked up her radio and called for backup. She dispatched every available unit to her own address, reporting a home invasion in progress. She stayed on the line with the officers, her voice returning to that professional, robotic calm that she used to survive the job. "Units are en route, Sarah," Dave said, coming back into the room and seeing the look on her face. "What's going on?" "Someone is in my house," she whispered, pointing at the phone screen. They watched together as the intruder moved through the house with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not look for jewelry or electronics. He went straight for the stairs. He climbed them slowly, one by one. 12:08 a.m. The man reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the master bedroom. He kicked the door open. Sarah watched on her phone as he scanned the empty room. He looked confused. He turned toward the closet, the exact place where the voice on the phone said she was hiding. He ripped the closet door open and lunged inside, swinging the knife. But the closet was empty. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She had changed the future. Because she had decided to come into work, the timeline had shifted. She was not there to be killed. But then the man in the video stopped. He looked directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. It was as if he knew she was watching him. He reached up, grabbed the camera, and the feed went black. 12:10 a.m. The exact time the call from the future was supposed to have ended. Sarah leaned back in her chair, shaking. Dave put a hand on her shoulder. "The police are there now, Sarah. They'll get him." They waited for the radio to crackle with news of an arrest. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Finally, the lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, came over the air. "Sarah, we've cleared the house. All floors are secure." "Did you get him?" Sarah asked, leaning toward the desk. "That's the thing, Sarah," Miller replied, his voice sounding puzzled. "The house is empty. There's no sign of a break-in. The sliding door is perfectly intact. The bedroom door is locked from the inside. We had to force entry, but there is nobody here." Sarah frowned. "But I saw him. I saw him break the glass. I saw him go into my bedroom. I have the recording on my phone." She opened her app to show Dave the recorded footage, but when she clicked on the history for 12 a.m., there was nothing. The log showed that the cameras had been offline for the past hour due to a scheduled firmware update. There was no footage of a man with a knife. There was no broken glass. Sarah felt a cold dread sink into her bones. She went home that night, escorted by 4 police officers. They searched every inch of the property again. They looked under the beds, in the attic, and behind the bushes. Nothing. The house was a fortress. For the next week, Sarah could not sleep. She jumped at every sound. She installed 3 more locks on every door and bought a heavy-duty safe for her bedroom. She became obsessed with the call. She went back into the dispatch archives to find the recording of the 911 call from that night. She found the log entry for 12 midnight, but when she played the audio, there was no voice. There was no screaming. There was only 10 minutes of absolute, dead silence. She began to wonder if she had suffered some kind of mental break. Perhaps the stress of the job had finally caught up to her, and she had hallucinated the entire thing. Her coworkers started looking at her with pity. Dave suggested she take some time off. But Sarah knew what she had heard. She knew the sound of her own voice dying. Months passed, and the memory began to fade, as traumatic memories often do. She started to convince herself that it really was just a strange glitch in the system combined with a panic attack. She went back to her normal routine. It was exactly 1 year later, October 28th, 2026. Sarah was at home. She had the night off. She was sitting in her living room, reading a book, feeling peaceful for the first time in a long time. The rain was drumming against the roof, a familiar, comforting sound in Oak Haven. She looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. She picked it up off the coffee table. The caller ID was blank. She felt a prickle of fear, but she answered it anyway. "Hello?" There was silence for a few seconds. Then, a voice. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional. 911. "What is your emergency?" Sarah dropped the book. The voice on the phone was her own, but it was not her voice from right now. It was the voice she used when she was at work. It was her dispatcher voice. "Who is this?" Sarah whispered. The voice on the other end continued. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address?" Sarah realized with a jolt of horror what was happening. She wasn't the caller this time. She was the one being watched. She looked toward the back of the house. Through the reflection in the dark window, she saw a shadow move across the patio. A man in a dark, hooded sweatshirt was standing there. He held a serrated kitchen knife in his right hand. He didn't have a device to break the glass this time. He didn't need one, because Sarah, in her paranoia over the last year, had replaced the glass with a reinforced sliding door that had a specific flaw in the latch that she had forgotten to fix. The man reached out, jiggled the handle, and the door slid open with a smooth, silent hiss. Sarah scrambled off the couch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized that the call she had heard a year ago wasn't from 10 minutes in the future. It was from a year in the future. The system hadn't glitched the date, it had glitched the year. She ran for the stairs, her phone still pressed to her ear. She could hear her own voice from a year ago, speaking to her from the dispatch center. "Ma'am, stay calm. Units are en route." But Sarah knew the truth now. The units weren't en route, because a year ago she had sent them to an empty house where nothing was happening. Tonight, because of the false alarm she had triggered back then, the police had flagged her address as a low priority for phantom calls. She reached the top of the stairs and ran into her bedroom. She slammed the door and locked it. She scrambled into the closet, pulling the slatted doors shut behind her. She heard the bedroom door kick open. She heard the heavy footsteps on the carpet. She huddled in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of her own clothes. She whispered into the phone, hoping that somehow her past self could hear the truth. "He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh God, please." The closet door was ripped open. The last thing Sarah Jenkins saw was the flash of a serrated blade in the moonlight. In the end, Sarah had spent a whole year trying to outrun a ghost, only to realize that every step she took to protect herself was actually building the trap she would eventually fall into. We often think that by knowing the future, we can change it, but sometimes the map we are given is the very thing that leads us to the end of the road. The Oak Haven police eventually found the man. He was a drifter who had been obsessed with Sarah for years, watching her from the woods, waiting for the perfect moment when she would be most vulnerable. He told the police that the only reason he found the courage to enter the house was because he saw her installing so many locks, and he realized how afraid she truly was. But as for that 911 call, it remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the department. The recording of the silence still sits in the archives, a 10-minute gap where a woman's life was supposedly saved, only to be taken exactly 365 days later. But that is a story for another time.